never tried to go for this big of a season. We've never gone through this much ground that we're supposed to go through this year. So Parker just really wants seamless sluicing through and through.
Somewhere in the frozen heart of the Yukon, a decision was about to be made that would tear one mining family apart and turn a quiet rivalry into an all-out war. And by the time the sun rose over that valley, nothing between these two crews would ever be the same again. This is the story of two miners, one ancient patch of ground, and the night that changed everything. For 3 seasons, Colt Bracken and Frank Delwood had circled each other like wolves guarding the same stretch of river. Colt was young, sharp, obsessed with data, the kind of miner who trusted numbers on a screen more than the feeling in his boots. Frank was the old guard, a man who had spent 30 years reading the ground with his hands and his gut, distrustful of anything that came out of a laptop. Their crews had clashed before over boundary lines, over water rights, over who got first crack at a promising bench. But nothing compared to what was about to happen on a cold, gray morning in the middle of the season, when Frank's crew was quietly surveying a patch of ground he had been chasing for 2 years, a patch he called, in front of his own family, his last real shot at saving the operation. Frank's season had not been kind to him. Fuel costs had eaten into every dollar the crew pulled out of the ground. 2 excavators had broken down within the same month, and the repair bills alone had wiped out what should have been a profitable July. His recovery numbers were down for the 2nd year running, and everyone on his crew knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. At home, his daughter Ruth had taken over more of the day-to-day operations while his son Danny kept the machines running on fumes and hope. There was a quiet, heavy tension that settled over the Delwood camp every evening, a sense that if this next patch didn't pay off, the crew might have to shrink or worse. Frank had staked his pride and his family's future on one stretch of ground he believed, based on decades of instinct, was sitting on a serious pocket of gold. Colt Bracken's season, by contrast, had been his smoothest yet. His crew was lean, well-funded, and equipped with the newest ground survey technology money could buy, subsurface radar units that mapped density variations far more precisely than anything Frank's generation had ever used. Colt trusted that technology completely, and it had rarely let him down. When his survey team ran a routine scan along a boundary near Frank's claim, something on the readout made every engineer in the truck go quiet. The density spike was unmistakable, 3 times higher than anything they had logged that season, concentrated in a narrow vein that curved down at an angle, almost like a funnel collecting gold that had been washing down that valley for centuries. The uncomfortable part, the part that would define the rest of the season, was where that vein sat. It ran right along the edge of Frank's stake claim, close enough that a few feet either way could mean the difference between it belonging to Frank or to Colt. The paperwork was murky. Frank's original stake had been filed years earlier, using older survey methods that didn't always line up perfectly with modern GPS boundaries. Colt's newer claim had been filed using precise satellite coordinates. Nobody on either crew knew for certain who had the legal right to that vein, and that uncertainty was about to become the spar for the biggest confrontation the valley had seen in years. Colt sat with his lead surveyor, Mara, staring at the readout for a long time before he said anything. He knew exactly what patch this was. He knew Frank had been talking about this ground around camp for weeks, telling anyone who'd listened that this was the one that would turn his season around. Colt also knew that if he waited even another day to confirm the boundary and file the paperwork properly, there was a real chance Frank's crew would beat him to testing it. And once Frank's excavators broke ground, any claim dispute would become infinitely messier. Mara asked him directly what he wanted to do. Colt didn't answer right away. He looked at the map for a long moment, then finally said, quietly, "We move at first light. Legal and clean. But we move." That night, Colt's tent stayed lit long after the rest of camp had gone dark. His foreman Deacon and 2 of his senior operators sat around a folding table covered in maps and printouts, going over the boundary lines one more time, checking every coordinate against the county filing records they'd pulled that afternoon. Colt wanted no ambiguity. If this was going to happen, he needed to be certain the ground technically fell inside his stake claim, because he knew exactly how this would look to Frank, and he knew exactly how it would look to anyone watching. Deacon asked him outright whether they had any legal exposure. Colt told him the survey data was clean, the paperwork checked out, and if they didn't move now, the opportunity would slip away. It wasn't recklessness driving him. It was the fear that hesitation would cost his crew a jackpot that legally, on paper, belonged to them. By 4 a.m, machines were rolling. Trucks crawled down the access road with their lights low, careful not to wake the camp a half-mile away. The wash plant was towed into position before the sky had even begun to lighten. Colt stood at the edge of the boundary line with a printed copy of the survey coordinates in his hand, double-checking the stake markers one more time before giving the signal. There was no shouting, no celebration, just quiet, methodical work, the kind that comes from a crew that knows exactly what it's doing and understands the stakes. Frank found out the way most people find out about the worst moments of their season. A phone call from a crew member who'd driven past the boundary at dawn and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Frank was in the middle of his morning coffee when Danny burst into the trailer and told him Colt's crew had machines running right along their eastern line. Frank didn't say a word. He set the coffee down, grabbed his jacket, and was in his truck before Danny had even finished the sentence. The drive over was short, but it felt endless. Frank's jaw was set the entire way, his knuckles white on the wheel. When he pulled up and saw the excavators already cutting into the ground he had spent 2 years planning for, something in him went cold. He got out of the truck and walked straight toward Colt, who was standing near the wash plant reviewing readouts on a tablet. The rest of both crews stopped what they were doing. Even the machines seemed to quiet down, though of course they didn't. Frank stopped a few feet from Colt and just stared at him for a moment, breathing hard, more from anger than a walk. Colt looked up, set the tablet down, and didn't say anything at first either. "You want to explain to me?" Frank finally said, his voice low and rough. "Why your machines are sitting on my ground?" Colt kept his voice steady. "It's not your ground, Frank. Our survey has it inside our boundary. I checked it 3 times last night before we moved." Frank shook his head slowly, the anger building. "I've worked this valley longer than you've been alive, kid. I know where my lines run." This was a man who looked genuinely worn down, and Colt, whatever else he was, wasn't someone who enjoyed watching another miner's hope collapse in front of him. But he also knew that if he backed off ground his own survey confirmed was legally his, he'd be setting a precedent his crew couldn't afford. And worse, if the vein really was as rich as the reading suggested, walking away wouldn't fix the underlying boundary dispute. It would just delay it. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," Colt said finally. "But I've got a crew depending on me too. Let's get the county surveyor out here today, settle the boundary properly, and whatever this ground turns out to be, we handle it the right way. If it's yours, it's yours. If it's mine, I work it. But I'm not shutting down before we know for sure." Frank didn't respond right away. He looked at the ground, at the excavator, at his own crew standing a distance away, unsure whether to intervene. Finally, he gave a short, tight nod, more out of exhaustion than agreement, and walked back toward his truck without another word. Within the hour, the first real test run began. The crew fed a sample load through the wash plant, and almost immediately, thick flakes of gold started collecting in the sluice, heavier and more concentrated than anything either crew had pulled that season. Colt's operators exchanged looks. One of them, a younger hand named Priya, actually laughed out loud in disbelief when she saw how much was catching in the riffles after just one run. Colt walked over, crouched down, and ran his fingers through the material. He didn't say much, just exhaled slowly and looked back toward the deeper cut they hadn't even reached yet. By afternoon, a county surveyor had arrived to formally reestablish the boundary using updated equipment. It was slow, careful work, checking old stakes against satellite coordinates, cross-referencing filing dates. Both crews stood at a distance, watching in tense silence as the surveyor moved his equipment back and forth along the disputed strip. When the surveyor finally straightened up and read off the corrected coordinates, the verdict was almost cruelly split. The richest section of the vein sat almost exactly on the line, with a slightly larger portion falling inside Colt's claim, but a meaningful piece extending in a ground that was unmistakably Frank's. Neither man got everything. Neither man got nothing. And in a strange way, that outcome forced something neither of them expected: a conversation. Standing at the boundary stake with the surveyor's report between them, Frank looked at Colt for a long moment before speaking. "Guess we're neighbors on this one," he said, and there was no warmth in it yet, but there wasn't the same fury from that morning either. Colt nodded. "We could fight this out in a legal mess for months and both lose money doing it. Or we could work it as a shared cut, split fair based on the survey line, and both crews walk away with something real this season." It wasn't an easy offer for Frank to accept. Pride was a heavy thing to set down, especially in front of his own children, who had watched the whole confrontation from the edge of camp. But Frank also knew his numbers better than anyone, and he knew what another lost season would mean. After a long silence, he put his hand out. Colt shook it. Over the following days, the two crews worked the shared vein in an uneasy but functional arrangement, machines from both camps operating on either side of the boundary line, radios occasionally crackling with terse but civil coordination. It wasn't friendship. Frank still muttered about young miners and their gadgets under his breath more than once, and Colt still rolled his eyes at some of Frank's old-school methods. But there was a grudging respect building underneath the tension, the kind that only comes from two people who nearly went to war and chose, instead, to find a way through it. The gold kept coming. Deeper cuts revealed an even richer pocket than the initial reading suggested, confirming that this stretch of ground really had been sitting on something extraordinary. For Frank, it meant the season he'd been praying for, the numbers that would keep his crew intact and his family's operation steady for another year. For Colt, it meant validation that his instinct to move fast, even under uncertainty, had paid off, but also a hard lesson about the cost of moving without full clarity first. On the last evening of the dig, as the sun dropped low over the valley and both crews wound down their machines for the day, Frank walked over to where Colt was reviewing the final tally on his tablet. He didn't say much, just stood next to him for a moment, looking out at the torn-up ground that had nearly destroyed their season and ended up saving it instead. "You did all right, kid," Frank said finally, gruffly, the closest thing to a compliment he was probably capable of giving. Colt just nodded, understanding exactly how much that admission cost a man like Frank. Neither of them said much else. They didn't need to. The gold in the boxes said enough. And that's how the fiercest rivalry the valley had seen in years nearly tore two mining families apart. And instead, against every expectation, became the season that taught both of them something about ground, about pride, and about what it really means to earn your claim.